you have this wonderful capacity to speak both of the theorizing a character in academic work, that we begin to see an overview, and yet your theorizing is very definitely oriented towards future generations and also towards the ancestors. And I find that's such a remarkable way to talk about the underpinnings of your thought. Can you say a bit more about that, how the reach forward is connected to the reach to the ancestors?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I've always been really fascinated with even the Western tradition and future generations. What's really interesting, though, is that it's only in the last 50 years that at least the mainstream Western tradition has started to take seriously this idea of our obligations to future generations. And as I mentioned earlier, because Māori philosophy begins at the intersections of a network, right? And that network sort of moves forwards and backwards in time, then intergenerational justice, as we might call it, is where we start. This idea that we have obligations to our ancestors and future people, and that those are intimately connected and integrated, is the place where our theorizing actually begins. So for instance, this idea of Kaitiakitanga, which has both spiritual and physical elements, requires, literally it means something like trusteeship, because kaitiaki means to care for and to look after, right? And so it's practices of looking after and caring, particularly in relation to the environment, which, as I've said, includes everything. To actually motivate or understand obligations to future generations within that kind of an idea, within Kaitiakitanga, trusteeship or stewardship, requires both what I like to call scientific knowledge, but also imagination, right? That's this idea of being connected to something, a past that we were not around to live through ourselves and a future we will not live to see. And so this idea that our lives are part of some kind of transcendental community, you can call it, or something outside of ourselves, is what I'm trying to say, is really important for Māori philosophy. And you can understand that idea of being part of something outside of ourselves, of our own brief lives, as being part of, as I've said, a transgenerational community, something that goes across time, and the way that, for instance, I can think of myself as being part of the Pacific voyages, right, of my early Māori ancestors, the Pacific voyagers who migrated here, who brought all these concepts and philosophical ideas and practices with them, and then grew them into this landscape in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how I can think of my own tupuna, Pōmare, who's from Ngāti Manu on the Taumarere River, how there's stories of Pōmare and what he said about the landscapes. And then there's stories of, for instance, Tohe, really famous Tai Tokerau tohunga, or spiritual leader, whose footsteps across the landscape from all the way from the top of the North Island, way down to the coast to Dargaville, huge distance by foot, how I can imagine myself as walking those footsteps and being part of the stories that he storied into the landscape, and how I can see myself as storying this landscape today in the same way that my ancestors did, right? And how I owe that to them to carry those stories and threads forward right round the Pacific, right down the coast of Aotearoa, New Zealand, to where we are today. So it's this kind of imagining ourselves as being connected to something beyond our own brief life, our own brief lives, and ancestors are central to that. And of course, I mean, that goes back to the centrality of the idea of whakapapa, which Manu Kahenare would have talked about, this idea that we are part of a network of ideas, a genealogical system that begins with the creation of the universe, with all these different kind of processes of creation that leads to us being here today, right? Being part of that universe is really central to understanding that any ideas or any claims about our responsibilities to future generations are embedded in that history that we carry forward through our ancestors.